Hi, I'm Ian Griffiths, and this is a talk from the Building Business Applications with Silverlight series. We're now going to take a look at the grouping features in data binding in Silverlight. And this is in the context of the schedule planner feature of the example application. So the goal here is to enable users who have signed up and registered for events to pick talks from those events and decide which ones they'd like to attend in their trip for the particular event. So we're going to use grouping to do this, and in later talks we're also going to look at some other related features. We're going to see the fluid UI animations, we're going to look at some new text layout features, word-based trimming, and we're going to look at right-click support as well. But for now, we're going to focus on grouping in data binding. So what we want to do when we show the user the list of talks that they might consider attending is we don't want to confront them with a complete list of all the talks across the whole event, because for some events that might be quite daunting. It might be a rather large list of things to look at. So instead what we're going to do is to break it down by track. We're going to show them the talks grouped by track. But we're not going to make them go through a master details view where we show them a list of track titles and then make them select the tracks to see them all. We're going to use instead the grouping features of the data grid. Now, the data grid has been able to do grouping for a while, but a feature that's newly added in Silverlight 4 is the ability to configure the grouping inside of the XAML. So what you can do is you can use a collection view source in the XAML, and you can add group descriptions to say how you'd like the events to be, or how you'd like your data source to be split into groups. And when you bind a data grid to a grouped data source, it will automatically add grouping headers for you. So it'll look like this. We'll see a list of talks, but between each set of talks you'll see a kind of title row showing the track details. And incidentally, as of Silverlight 4, the mouse wheel now works correctly out of the box with the data grid. Not technically relevant to the task like hand, but it's an extra feature that's grown on the most recent version of the data grid. So by default, simply having a grouped data source is enough to cause the extra rows to appear. We can customize that row if we want to, and there's various things we can do there. But simply turning on the grouping on the collection view source is something the data grid itself will detect and will automatically switch on the behavior. So let's build this. So I've added a page to my application for the schedule planner, and if I run this up, I've also added a link to the top of my main host window. If I click on that, it will take me to the page. Right now it's empty because I've not written anything. But I have already written a view model for this that does most of the work of fetching the necessary information. So when this page loads, we're going to use the get events with tracks and talks query. And we added this in an earlier talk. This retrieves data for an event with all the associated tracks and all the talks associated with those tracks. And then once that's finished loading, we actually flatten that out here using a link to objects query. We flatten that out into an array that contains just the talks. So ultimately this will return me all the talks for a particular event, and it will make it available in a public property of my view model. And that property is up here, and you can see I'm implementing property change notifications so that the data binding system will know when my properties have changed. So I can make use of this over here in my schedule planner. So I've already instantiated the view model here, so I should be able to add to my UI, if I just drop a data grid in here, and I'm going to enable automatic generation of columns, and I'm going to bind this thing's item source to the collection on my view model. So if I find the items source property here, and say apply data binding, I can say I'd like to use that view model as the source object, and then for the path, I'm going to pick up the talks collection as the data source for the data grid. Now, at the same time, I'm also going to let the view model know which item is selected. You may have noticed there was another property in there, which was called selected item. I can bind the selected item of the data grid to that same view model. There is a selected talk property, which is going to represent the currently chosen talk, and that way, by binding the data grid's selected item property to the selected talk of my view model, the view model knows which items are selected, which item is selected right now. So if I run this, and again go to that page, you can see I've got a flat list of all of the talks for a particular event. Actually, I've hard-coded it in the view model to pick out just the first event, but this is all the talks for the first event. You can see they're all on different tracks because you can see the event track ID here, but that's just being displayed as undifferentiated data. The fact they happen to be grouped together one after another is coincidence because that's the order they came out of the link query. We're not yet using the grouping header feature of the data grid to display a collapsible, expandable set of groups. So the way we can do this is to define a collection view source that does grouping. So let's call this grouping source, and I'm going to bind this actually to the same source that my data grid is currently using as its item source. So I want to use all those talks as the source for my collection view source, and then I can set this thing's group, oops, if I hit the right keys, group descriptions. In here I can add any number of grouping criteria. So I can group by property. I'm going to say I would like to group on the property called event track. And if I now use this collection view source as the data source for the grid rather than going directly to my view model, so if I change this items view source, oops, missed. Do that again. If I set the source rather than being the view model, if I just make it the grouping source, so that's now just bound to that collection view source object. That should be enough to turn on grouping. So let's go to the schedule. And now you can see it's added these extra grouping rows in between everything else. So it's grouped everything from event track 9 under this section here. So I can expand and collapse these. And so the data grid has noticed that my source is advertising the availability of groups. So there's a property that the collection view interface defines called is grouping, and if that's switched on, the data grid will just go and retrieve the grouped information and present things in this way. Now this is not quite perfect. The text that's being shown here, it's saying event track colon 10. It's basically just calling toString on the object by which we're grouping things. When you use REA services, it so happens that the toString, the default override of toString, just shows the type of object, followed by a colon, followed by a list of all the keys that identify the entity. In this case, the event track only has a single key, so we just see a single number. We could do a bit better than this. The simplest way would just be to add an override for toString specifically for that type. So I'm going to quickly show you that. It's not the best way of doing it, so I'm going to do it in a sort of slightly hacky way, and I'll show you a better way of doing it in a moment. But this is one quick and easy way of getting it to work. If I do a public partial class definition for event track, I get to add my own members in on top of the members that are generated for me by REA services. So remember that because I've used REA services to import my model types here, it's generated me client-side copies of all those models, but they're all partial classes, so I can add my own functionality. And the default toString override comes from the base entity class and not from the imported code. So I am free to override toString here in the event track class itself. I know why it's not helping me. I've forgotten to put the namespace in here. Namespace SL event manager .web, and hopefully that will now do it for me. There we go. So I'm going to return just the event title. Sorry, the event track title. So Visual Studio's found the event track title because it can see this is a partial class definition, and it can go and find, if I go to the definition, In the generated code, sl-event-manager.web.g.cs, we saw in an earlier talk that this is where Visual Studio puts the imported model definitions. So this is where it's imported all the properties from the event track, and I'm just adding in a toString that uses that to control how the event track is displayed. So if I run this again and go once more to my schedule page, you can see it's saying event track : usability, event track : developer designer workflow. That's an improvement. It means I'm no longer just calling toString and showing an ID. But I might want to take a bit more control in this because it's still printing out the raw property name here. It's saying event track. If you really want to control this, you actually have to bring your own template for the entire group's header. So you can't sort of just control the individual caption here. You either have to use the built-in look or you've got to bring your own complete control template. And we would do this, if I comment this back out again and revert to what we had before. So if we go into the XAML, what I need to do is add some suitable styles to my data grid. I'm going to paste in a snippet that I wrote earlier here. So what I've done here is I'm setting the data grid's row group header styles property. This is a collection of styles. The reason it's a collection is that you can have multiple levels of grouping, and you can define one style for each level. I've only got the one level here, so I've only got the one style. And inside the style, we can set the template for the data grid row group header control, which is the control that the data grid uses to show the contents of the individual headers. So inside this control template, I can customize how that's going to appear. So I could, for example, say I'd like to have a text block with a font size of 18, and I can take the text and I can bind it to. So the name property gives me the grouped object. So name is a slight misnomer. It is effectively whatever comes back from here. So we specify the name of the property we're going to group by, event track in this case, and that's what pops out here. So I can say name.event_track title, and assuming I've remembered the name of the property right, that should show just the event track title name as the grouping section. So there we are. Now, as it happens, the data grid constrains the height for that particular row, so this is overflowed slightly, so I'd need to do a little bit more work to make that look right. But you can see that I'm able to customize exactly what appears there. Let's crank that down a little bit, and that should be OK. So, by turning on the grouping at the collection view source level, by specifying grouping criteria here, the data grid detects that we've done this, enables its grouping behavior. It'll show items in expandable groups, and then if we provide a custom control template for the data grid row group header, we can customize how that appears. So that handles things as far as the data grid is concerned, but that's not the only situation in which we might want to use grouping. Items controls, such as the list box and combo box and other things based on that same base class, can also use grouped data sources, but it requires a little bit more work, because unlike the data grid control, which has an intrinsic understanding of what a grouped data source is, the items control does not. It doesn't recognize a grouped data source when you give it one. If you turn on grouping for a data source, it'll just ignore that. It will carry on showing the items ungrouped, as though you hadn't turned on grouping at all. However, that does not stop us from using the grouping services. All we have to do is make sure that when we bind to a group data source, that we tell the binding expression to use the groups rather than the raw items. So in the case of our example application, when the user starts selecting talks, it will be useful if we group them by time slot. That way, if the user tries to add 2 talks from the schedule at the same time, it's fairly clear that they've done that. We don't want to prevent them from doing that. We don't want to treat that as an error, because the user might not have decided which talks they're going to attend yet. They might say, well, I could do this one, I could do that one. I'd like to decide on the day which one I feel more like going to. And so we're going to let them put 2 things in their plan, but we want to make sure they both appear under the same sort of time slot heading. So we're going to group the chosen talks by time slot. And to do this, we simply point the item source of an items control at the group's property of the collection view source. So we explicitly bind to the collection of groups, and then we can expand out each group with a nested items control inside the data template, as you can see on this slide here. We can bind to the items property of the group to show the child items. So let's do this. If we look at the view model that I wrote earlier, we've got the talks collection, which we're currently binding the data grid to, and a selected talk showing the currently selected item. But I've also got a couple more things. I've got a chosen talks collection. That's an observable collection, so that's able to change. And if we change the items in there, the data binding system will see the changes because that will raise notification events. And I've also, a little further down, I've written a command which I've exposed through a public property called add talk, which enables us to create a button, bind it to that command, and when the button is clicked, this onAddTalk method will be called. I've wired that up in the constructor. Let me just show you that very quickly. So my relay command is pointing at that onAddTalk method. So when the user clicks a button hooked up to this command, it'll run this code here. This code will say, well, is there a selected talk right now? And is it already in the chosen talks collection? If there is a selected talk and it's not currently chosen, then we add it to the chosen talks, and that should appear in the list of talks on the right-hand side. So we can add a couple more items to our user interface to take advantage of this. So I'm going to add, next to the data grid, I'm going to add a items control. And for its item source, well, I'm going to add another collection view source. So let me go up and write that. So next to my grouping source, let's have a similar source. Let's call this grouping chosen talks. And it's going to bind to the view model, and it's going to pick out chosen talks. And what are we going to bind by? We're going to bind by start time. So down here, I'm going to bind to that grouping chosen talks. So I've got a second collection view source, which is also grouping, and it's showing the contents of the chosen talks collection. And of course, we need a button as well. And this I need to bind to the addTalk command property of my view model. So I'm going to bind it to that. And the source in this case is going to be the view model. Let me go and copy out the relevant code for that. Source equals my view model. So let's see if that's all wired up correctly. I'm going to put a breakpoint in there just so we can watch it happening. We'll try running that. Go to the schedule page. And, oops, right now, my button appears to be disabled. Why has that happened? Probably because I haven't enabled it. I may also have got the binding expression wrong. That was called addTalk. Binding path equals addTalk. Source equals my view model. Looks like we should be OK. It's looking better. That's now no longer grayed out. So let's select an item, click Add. So the selected talk property, remember earlier we bound that to the data grid selected item, so my view model knows what item is selected. Chosen talks collection, maybe I should make that non-null. That would probably work better. That won't be helping. So that will add the item. So the remaining thing we've got to do is fix the layout, because right now we've got some overlapping UI items. So let me go back to here. I want my data grid and my list box to be in different parts of the grid, so let me add column definitions. Grid with 2 columns. My data grid will be in the first column, and my items control, well, actually I already put that in the second column. I just hadn't defined the column, so that's why it wasn't working quite right. And let's make this button go right in the middle by centering it within the 2 columns. So now I should find if I go to the schedule, pick a talk, and add it, let me clear that breakpoint, things start to appear over on the right. Now interestingly, although I turned on grouping on the second data source that I added, even though I asked to group the controls, to group the talks by their start time, nothing is actually happening here. And the reason for that, there's 2 reasons for that. One, I got the name of the property wrong, but even when I fix the property, talk start time, we'll still see the same issue. Because it turns out that the items control just completely ignores the fact that a data source is grouping. So I can turn on grouping, like I have done here. I can even fix the property name. But it makes no difference because turning on grouping does not turn off the standard behavior of the collection view source. The collection view source continues to present all the same source objects as before. It also additionally offers grouping information for them for controls that care, like the data grid. Controls that don't care, like the items control, carrying on behaving as before. So if we want to bind to the groups, we need to use a slightly different binding expression here. So right now my item source is bound to that source object there, the collection view. If I actually want to show the groups, I have to do this. Path equals groups. So I'm saying I know this collection view source exposes a collection of groups. That's what I'd like to show. So if I add a talk now, something else appears. It's saying ms.internal.collectionViewGroupInternal. That is the data type that the collection view source uses to group talks together. So if I select 3 talks, I get 3 groups. If I select another talk that happens to start at the same time as one of the existing ones and click Add, I don't see anything new appearing. What's actually happening is that those groups are growing extra internal members, but I can't see that because I've yet to provide a data template to expand the group content. So that's the next thing for me to do. So I'm showing group data, but now I have to tell the items control how I'd like that group data to appear. And I can do that by providing the items control with an item template. And I'm going to use a stack panel to show the various pieces of information here. First of all, in bold, I am going to show the name property of the group. And remember, as we saw earlier when I was customizing the header row for the data grid, the name property refers to the criteria we use for grouping, which in this case happened to be just the one property, the talk start time. So that should display the value of the talk start time property. Let me run that. Go to my schedule, add an item, and we see the time printed out in full. Obviously, I could do a little bit of extra work to format that better, but you can see it's starting to work. I've got groups for 9 AM, 10 AM, 11 AM. If I start adding more from the same time slot from different tracks, then those are just going into that first group. So the next thing I've got to do now is add another feature in the data template to pick out the items inside the group. And we can do that like this. I can put an items control inside the item template for my outer items control. So I've got nested item controls. And I can bind this child item controls item source to be path equals items. The group objects that we get by binding the outer items control to the group's property, the collection view source. The individual objects we get back provide us with a name property and an items property to tell us the group name and the items within the group respectively. So now with that in place, if I run again, go to the schedule, select an item, you can see talk 1 has appeared in there. So I've got different groups here. If I add several talks at the same time, you can see they're all appearing underneath the same group there. And obviously I could then go on to provide another item template for my nested items control to customize how the individual groups work. So for the data grid, it is sufficient to just turn on grouping on a collection view source. The data grid will detect that and will automatically add group headers. We're free, if we want to customize the way that that appears. So we can customize the group header template by providing a control template, and it will use that to display those rows. In the case of items controls, we have a little bit more work to do because the items control and its derived types like list box and combo box do not implicitly understand grouping in Silverlight. So for those, we have to do a bit more work. We have to explicitly point their item source at the groups property of the grouping collection view source. And then we have to write an item template that pulls out the information we require from the group header and also provides a nested items control to display the contents of each individual group.